Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Education and Culture Committee meeting. We have two items on our agenda today, one of which is a briefing on our Office of Legislative Oversight State School Construction Aid Eligibility and Funding of Ncps capital projects. And then we have a work session on our Montgomery County Public Schools Capital Improvements Program. So it's all school capital today. Both from the think tank side and from the operational side in terms of what needs to be done. So this is good stuff. For all of you policy wonks that are out there who care about school construction, this is the meeting for you. So you're in the right place. And so with that, I do want to turn it over to Office of Legislative Oversight, both Stephanie Bryan and Aaron Trumka, and thank them as always for their great work. OLO, over my years of being on this council, have been instrumental in helping us to really think differently about how government operates, to be innovative and thought-provoking in terms of how we can address some of the pressing issues that are before this county and before this county council. And so just really want to thank you for your great years of leadership and great work. I know that I speak for all of my colleagues in that we owe a debt of gratitude to OLO because, again, as folks challenge government to be different, OLO helps us to do just that. And so with that, Stephanie and Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through some of the points, but did just want to say that, again, when it comes to school construction, it's a tough subject because it's always something that we know is incredibly important to all of us, but we always end up not having enough money to do everything that we know we need to. And so it forces us to be incredibly creative in terms of how we can make sure that we're maximizing every dollar that comes into this county that we utilize for school construction, but also that it's well spent and that we certainly are prioritizing the needs that we have in our community. I know that my colleagues on the Education and Culture Committee struggle with this each and every day as we try to determine which projects are ones that move forward, understanding that they all have need. They all are certainly qualified in terms of what needs to happen in our community to address whether it's overcrowding issues, whether it's the age of the building, whether it's the innovative new programs that need to go in that can't go in the space that we already have. All of those things are important. And unfortunately, we can't do them all. And so we're trying to figure out ways in which we can work with our state partners to hopefully help to accelerate many of these projects that we know are going to do great things in our community. So with that, I've filibustered long enough. I know that's a bad word. And I've filibustered long enough to have Councilmember Javando join us. Welcome, sir. And I will turn it over to Aaron and Stephanie.
All right. Well, thank you, Chair Rice. And we'll try to meet the thought-provoking standard that you set for us. I'm going to ask Stephanie if she can put the presentation up on the share screen. And when that's ready, we will start.
I need permission to share my screen.
You should be able to share now if not already.
Thank you.
And we're ready to go. Great, thank you. So I'm Aaron Trumka, and as you saw, I'm joined by my colleague Stephanie Bryant, and we're here to present our report on state school construction eligibility funding and funding of MCPS capital projects. So the council asked OLO to look at how the county could achieve higher levels of state support for school construction projects. The motivation for the support was straightforward. It would appear, at least on paper, that MCPS capital projects should be eligible for state aid of up to 50% of project costs. However, for recent major MCPS projects, state aid has comprised no more than 20% of total costs. Given the pressures of MCPS enrollment, as well as the chair mentioned of competing demands on the capital budget, the council wanted to learn if there are ways to increase state aid as a percent of school project costs. Our assignment from the council was to assess which state aid eligibility criteria have the greatest effect on capital project funding and to identify possible changes to state policies and MCPS practices that could raise state aid as a percentage of school construction costs. So when the council first suggested this project, we quickly determined that we needed to tap into the knowledge and expertise of others, particularly if we were to meet the end of calendar 2021 deadline. We convened a working group consisting of representatives from NCPS, OMB, Intergovernmental Relations, and our own central staff colleagues. Our final report is a product of this collaborative effort, and we thank each member of the working group for their important contributions. The working group met 7 times last fall to study MCPS capital project costs, facility, and state aid data, fiscal constraints affecting the county CIP, state rules governing the distribution of state aid, and state, county, and MCPS policies and practices that affect eligibility for state aid. While the state funding formula is replete with complexities, the objective of increasing state aid as a percent of project costs is very simply understood in the form of a ratio. That ratio being the amount of state aid dollars received over the dollar costs of a project. So, to increase this ratio, you have to do one of 2 things. You must either increase the numerator, which is state aid, or decrease the denominator, project costs. So let's talk about project costs. One way to increase the percentage would be to reduce those project costs. Now, as we'll soon explain, the state establishes what is known as the gross area baseline. That is the maximum building square footage per student that is eligible for state aid. MCPS, and we'll note many other large school systems in the state, routinely build schools with average square footage per student that exceeds the state baseline. We found that implementation of county program priorities is a primary cause for the construction of larger than baseline schools. For example, this is something the chair cited. Many MCPS school buildings include additional space to accommodate initiatives such as class size reduction, magnet programs, health and social support services, think things like linkages to learning. We note that while the state funding formula does not account for these programs, most are similar to the initiatives and priorities of the state's new blueprint for education. Another cause for larger MCPS buildings. Projected enrollment growth in parts of Montgomery County are higher than experienced elsewhere in the state. For the sake of efficiency, MCPS has constructed some schools to accommodate projected enrollment growth that goes beyond the state's 6-year timeframe. A couple of other factors that contribute to the size and cost of MCPS school buildings. As you'll soon hear, the state deducts aid for construction projects of schools adjacent to other schools that have available seats. The rationale for this policy is that seats should be fungible and that a school system can move students among schools to maximize the utilization of capacity. However, MCPS tries to minimize the disruptive practice of frequently relocating small numbers of students from one school to another. As a last example, Montgomery County, our local building and environmental standards, such as stormwater management requirements, are often more costly than elsewhere in the state, increasing project costs for MCPS. So, to reduce the denominator in that funding ratio, the county would need to revisit many of these existing policies and practices. Now, to be clear, we are not saying that dropping these practices are desirable or even palatable. What we are saying, though, that is, if the goal is to stretch available CIP dollars to fund more projects, then these types of trade-offs would need to be considered in the absence of an increase in state aid. But let's return to the topic of state aid. Stephanie will now describe the state funding formulas.
I'm going to provide an overview of the traditional state aid formula for new and replacement schools. School systems submit annual capital improvement requests for projects to the Interagency Commission on School Construction, or the IAC. State law grants authority to the IAC to develop a funding formula to calculate state aid per project. The funding formula is written into IAC regulations. The traditional state aid program applies to eligible projects, including new and replacement schools. Many MCPS CIP projects are mandatory in nature and critical to school operations, for example, ADA compliance and fire and safety code upgrades. However, while these projects may be funded as part of a larger construction project, they are generally ineligible for state aid as standalone projects. Within eligible projects, only select construction costs are eligible for state funding, as defined in state regulations and interpreted by the IAC. These are typically considered brick and mortar construction costs. The Build to Learn Act expanded eligible costs to include planning and design and selected furniture, fixtures, and equipment for all IAC projects. On the screen is a list of projects that are ineligible for state aid. As shown, state aid does not cover the full cost of construction. The state's cost share of a project's funding begins with removing ineligible costs, as represented by the gray shaded portion of the pie chart. IAC defined eligible costs do not cover the full cost of construction. Ineligible costs must be paid for with local dollars. The IAC then applies a funding formula to calculate the total state aid per project based on eligible costs. I'm going to briefly walk through the state aid formula, beginning with calculating the gross area baseline. The IAC uses the gross area baseline, or GAB, to determine eligible school size. To calculate the gross area baseline, the formula is as follows. Enrollment projections. School systems submit enrollment projections for each project, and enrollment capacity for nearby schools that serve the same grade levels, known as adjacent capacity. The IAC may subtract adjacent capacity from the project request on a one-to-one basis, regardless of the number of seats available. The IAC then multiplies enrollment projections by allowable square feet, which are set by the IAC based on grades or programs served. For example, regular education students, the IAC sets between 105 square feet and 160 square feet per student based on program level, elementary, middle, or high school. For any addition or partial tear-down replacement, existing or remaining building square feet are subtracted from the project request by the IAC. So enrollment projections multiplied by allowable square feet equals the gross area baseline. Next, the IAC determines the total project cost eligible for state aid. To calculate the total project cost, the IAC takes the gross area baseline, multiplies the gross area baseline by cost per square foot, which is set annually by the IAC based on market conditions and prior year bids. This cost may be adjusted prior to final project approval. So the gross area baseline multiplied by the cost per square foot equals the total project cost eligible for state aid. As shown, the gross area baseline, including adjacent capacity, allowable square feet, and existing square feet calculations, have the cumulative effect of further reducing the state's cost share, as represented by the gray shaded portions of the pie chart. School systems must pay for any costs, seats, and square feet above the gross area baseline. The IAC then uses a formula to adjust the remaining project costs eligible for state aid based on the county's wealth. The IAC uses a wealth equalized formula to determine the percentage of total eligible costs covered by state aid. The state share ranges between 50% and 100%, depending on a county's wealth. No county receives less than a 50% cost share. This is a funding floor. Montgomery County is one of 5 counties where the state cost share is 50%. The state cost share is reduced to 24.9% for projects not bid with prevailing wage, regardless of the funding floor. Of note, prevailing wage applies to the total cost of construction, not just eligible costs. Shown is the existing wealth adjustment formula that determines the state cost share and how the percentage is summed for Montgomery County. The blueprint formula is the starting point for the capital cost share. For Montgomery County, 3 percentages, the state share of the foundation, enrollment growth, and local debt add up to 40.3%. Since the formula results in a state share of less than 50%, Montgomery County benefits from the funding floor, receives a 50% cost share, and more state aid per project, assuming prevailing wage. However, when we look back at the total size of state aid in comparison to project costs, shaded in gray, we find that NCPS must pay for the bulk of school construction costs with local dollars. In recent years, out of the total cost of construction, MCPS has received between 15 and 20% state aid for new and replacement school projects. I'm going to briefly touch on key aspects of the Built to Learn Act. State law allocates total Built to Learn funding by county. The Act allocated $370 million to MCPS over the next 10 years. While the Act determines total funding, formulas and project-specific funding are under the authority of the IAC and the Maryland Stadium Authority, meaning similar eligibility rules for the traditional state aid program may apply to Built to Learn projects. One notable advantage under the Built to Learn Act is that school systems that forward fund and receive a 50% cost share are eligible to receive up to 150% of the gross area baseline. However, uncertainty exists in how the rules and formulas will be applied. Moving forward, key decision points will focus on project eligibility.
So after studying the state funding formula and its impact on actual dollars received, the working group put together a list of 6 modifications to state policies that could increase state aid as a percentage of construction costs. First, the group stresses that a positive change in one area of the funding formula should not be canceled out by offsetting reductions elsewhere. The county should ask that the state maintain its commitment to the legislative intent of the Build to Learn Act and to maintain prior levels of traditional construction aid. Second, the county should request an expansion of the list of projects eligible for cost share to include standalone systemics, such as restroom renovations, ADA compliance, fire and safety upgrades. Third, the county should request an increase in the cost share funding floor above 50%. Remember, the county's 50% share is the lowest funding floor among Maryland counties. Fourth, request a more robust and transparent IAC appeals process. The current appeals process is rigidly tied to the funding formula and does not promote flexibility, including review of programmatic needs and cost efficiencies. Fifth, we should ask that the state amend the funding formula to set a minimum number of available seats when deducting for adjacent capacity. The group suggested that adjacent schools with less than 150 available seats be exempt from the enrollment reduction. And last, sixth, the county should team with other counties to request square footage allowances for programs consistent with the Blueprint for Education standards, including space for initiatives such as class size reduction, early childhood education, career and college and career readiness. So this concludes our report summary. We have invited Melanie Wenger here to provide us with an update on the developments in Annapolis that have occurred since the release of the report. And so Mel, turning it over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. And it was great working with OLO group and my other colleagues on this study. And so I wanted to just start by saying that for several years now, there's been a group in Annapolis made up of state legislators chaired by Delegate McIntosh out of Baltimore City called the Assessment and Funding of School Facilities Work Group. And they focused a great deal of attention on some of the issues that surfaced as we worked with the Office of Legislative Oversight on this report. We have 2 members. The Montgomery County delegation has 2 members of that work group. One is Senator Nancy King, who is the chair of the Education Subcommittee and Budget and Tax, and also the Majority Leader. And the other is Delegate Mark Corman, who is on the House Appropriations Committee. So there's been lots of dialogue with them over the summer since this exercise began about the types of things that we were seeing as we worked through this process. So that work group finalized their meetings on these topics on December 15. And we had anticipated that their final report would already be out, but we're anticipating that it will be out this week, along with probably a piece of legislation that will revise statute to reflect some of the recommendations that they're going to be making. They're making a lot of recommendations, so I'm going to focus on the types of things that I think are most relevant to the Office of Legislative Oversight report and this discussion. So here's what I can tell you that I know today without actually seeing the final report. There's going to be some changes made to how the Interagency Committee on School Construction views enrollment. I'm going to put my glasses on here for a second to help me out. So the IAC has a great deal of authority to determine what the enrollment is. In fact, they have really the final authority over that. And there was not an appeals process. One of the recommendations coming from the work group is that is now going to be, there will be a formal appeals process. So if there's a dispute between the school system and the IAC on what the enrollment projections are for a project that's being reviewed, there's going to be an additional avenue now if that dispute's not resolved. Also, We talked about Aaron talked about the adjacency issue, and there's going to be changes recommended to that. What I think will happen is it will be a percentage. So for example, if the project that's under review, if there are adjacent schools around that are under enrolled, that under enrollment would have to be at least 15% under enrolled in order to count against, again, the enrollment for the project that's under review. It's not certain it'll be 15, but that was the final discussion. And I think that this is something that will be very helpful. There's also going to be changes to the definition of gross area baseline. And this is something that I'm anxiously awaiting to see the final report to see how they're going to address this. But one thing we know is that the blueprint, as enacted, has a lot of different programs and a lot of different demands on physical space. And so the recommendation out of the work group was that that is going to be reviewed and gross area baseline is going to be revised to reflect, to be consistent with the recommendations that were made from the blueprint legislation. So again, hopefully that's going to be helpful, a helpful change. Also, there's going to be some changes related to the state share. There's going to be kind of a system of incentives set up that relate to school facilities assessment data that would allow a project, if they meet certain criteria. And again, I think that it's going to be important to see how the final report describes this, to know how beneficial it will be to a county like Montgomery. But it would add percentage points on. So if Montgomery County, we describe Montgomery County as a 50% county as far as the state share of what's determined to be eligible costs for a project, you would have, a higher state share based on whether or not the project that you are discussing with them meets certain criteria related to the maintenance of the school, basically. 5% add-on related to something like that. Another potential 5% add-on if the project's going to be net zero. And then something that's, as I think is going to be very beneficial to the county, is that there's going to be an add-on of 10 percentage points or 5 percentage points for concentration of poverty schools. And so we know we actually have a number of those schools. We have a number of projects coming up that would qualify for that higher state share. About the statewide facilities assessment data, which there's been, I think, a lot of angst expressed about the use of this data. There's going to be a delay in the use of the data till at least fiscal 25 and potentially beyond as this continues to be discussed and vetted. I also wanted to highlight a piece of legislation that's already been introduced. And in fact, the bill hearing has taken place already. One issue that relates to the Built to Learn Act that was, I think, a surprise to a lot of the local education agencies when they found this out. The IAC, along with the Maryland State Authority, under the authority that they had granted to them, decided that the Built to Learn funds could not be used for any systemic renovation project that didn't exceed $4 million. And again, there are a number of other counties that were going to heavily subscribe their Built to Learn funds just for projects like that. And while the IAC and the Maryland State Authority were going to allow bundling, that was still kind of an unwelcome edict, I think, to a lot of the counties. So a piece of legislation has been introduced that removes any threshold at all for systemic renovation projects for use of Built to Learn funds. So again, that's just, I think it's helpful and a welcome change. And I believe that piece of legislation, either that piece of legislation will pass or possibly something like that will be moved into the package of legislation that will reflect the recommendations of the School Facilities Assessment Work Group. I think I think I've covered the highlights. And again, as soon as the report is out, anyone who's interested, be glad to forward it. And of course, when the legislation's in, that is a piece of legislation that I know that the Office of Intergovernmental Relations will be bringing to the council.
So we'll turn the conversation over to the chair and to the committee. I do note that we do have our colleagues from the working group from OMB and from council staff joining us if you have any questions. And with that, Mr. Rice, discussion is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron and Stephanie, and thank you, Mel, for your great synopsis of what's happening in Annapolis, as well as what you read in the tea leaves. Let me just start off before I turn to some of my colleagues who may have questions or comments as well. Our schools have changed, and it is hopeful that folks will understand at the state level that our schools have become very different places in terms of what's expected of them versus when we passed these laws some decades ago about what we would expect to happen within our school walls. The reality is that when we look at mental as well as physical health, there is a need for us to make sure that that attachment is there. I know that Councilmember Navarro feels very strongly about this in high school wellness centers. In every single one of our schools, it's tied into blueprint recommendations that really highlight community schools. And it's interesting, when I look back at what we highlighted as community schools, which was the aspiration of all of our schools were to be community schools. All of those things that Aaron, you laid out in terms of what it is that we do, from linkages to health-based supports, all of those things take space. And English as a second language, one of the things that wasn't listed there also in those classrooms and what it is we do there, as well as special education, are also things that take up space in our schools. And so it really is important for folks to understand that our schools have become more than a place for you to just learn your ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It really is something where, when we're talking about the whole child and making sure that we are a community asset, our schools have become those places. And so from that standpoint, the space requirements have grown exponentially. And Montgomery County, quite honestly, has been on the forefront of that expansion in terms of what our schools are doing for our children. So from that standpoint, I'm just curious as to, and Mel, maybe you could answer this better than Aaron or Stephanie or any of my other colleagues. I guess maybe our folks from Ncps, I'd like to hear from them as well, maybe from Seth, just in terms of what we're hearing on the ground when it comes to folks understanding that that is the new normal. And I hate to use that, but that's the new normal when it comes to our schools. Our schools are no longer just a place where you go into a classroom and you sit there for 45 minutes for your class and you go to the next one. That's not the expectation that we're seeing any longer. And if folks are finally embracing that and understanding that the formulas, the policy requirements, all of those things are better reflective of that sort of initiative. Yeah. So
I as far as my views, I felt like that the conversation that has taken place over the summer with this the facilities assessment work group is beginning to acknowledge that. And I think sending the message even to the IAC that we need to think differently. And we need to be that I think part of this stemmed from this just constant, state constraint over finances. And so I guess I would kind of describe it as almost a miserly approach to ensuring that there's a limited amount of state funds that have to go across the state, and that it was just almost an exercise in doing, very, very carefully meeting those funds out and setting very, very stringent rules on eligibility. And I just feel like the conversation with the blueprint and the conversation that took place with this group over the summer is sending a new message that we need to be more flexible, and we need to, if we're going to do something as aggressive as the blueprint, which is just a whole new way of thinking about educating children in a much more holistic way, well, the physical plan has to allow for those programs to flourish. Otherwise, you will not meet your objectives. So I'm hopeful, and again, I'm anxious to see this final report on how they alter the gross area baseline to reflect these new programs in the blueprint.
Seth, what are you hearing from your colleagues in similar roles across the state in terms of where they think or hope that folks are? And is this something that is still unique to Montgomery County, or are you hearing that others across the state are starting to get that this is the new way moving forward for our schools?
Well, Councilmember Rice, you were spot on in terms of this understanding of where schools were decades ago, how we staffed these buildings, the programs that were contained within these programs. But as I can tell you, as we've worked with our colleagues across the state and every LEA, this understanding that the schools are changing, that you need spaces for some of the supports that are required of our students is becoming critical. So as we heard from Mel, a lot of the conversations at the state level is, again, thinking outside of the box in terms of what the norms were in, let's say, the 80s, 90s versus, where we are headed as a state, and really understanding what that means from a building standpoint. One of the ideas that we continue to say over and over again is that the state has really, and colleagues have said this all along as well, the state has been caught in this notion of building first and then program comes in. But obviously, as we're transitioning, we're developing the program, we're developing the supports, and building infrastructure to meet that. So I think I'm encouraged from the perspective that this is not unique to Montgomery County. This is something that we partnered with our other colleagues and LEAs, and something that seems to be gaining traction at all corners of the state.
Well, thank you very much for that. I have a couple others, but I'm going to turn to Councilmember Navarro. She's got her hand raised. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to hear this exchange, because I am absolutely convinced that this pandemic in particular has, exacerbated but also accelerated the changes in our communities by a factor of 3 to 5 years. And there's been a lot written about this. And these changes are not going to go back to the way things were, which means that even as we're talking about many of these particular efforts and these work groups, et cetera, there is going to have to be an opportunity to reassess exactly what it is that we are pushing and what we're trying to do. It's interesting to kind of hear the exchange, because it reminds me of the up-team conversations that we've had in the past about community schools, about the role, for example, of libraries having evolved almost to like a community center type situation. The hubs concept, which we, would talk about for forever in the space of like early care and education and having hub models. So it's interesting, because I think that at least here in Montgomery County, we have had a lot of conversations, and we have also pursued many initiatives that are rooted in a lot of these templates. But I firmly believe that now, given everything that has happened, there will need to be this almost a moment where folks need to take a step back to assess the situation on the ground. That again, I think has changed dramatically even within the last 12 months. And I worry that if we don't do that, then we might find, somebody will find themselves here 10 years from now saying, hey, this didn't quite work. This is a bit obsolete, or we've missed opportunities. some of us talked about linkages to learning, and there was a desire to follow this particular list, where things were ranked. And I remember when Uma Ahluwalia was director of HHS, us having conversations in committee about why are we waiting for that perfect alignment of that list when we knew we had schools that were going through construction, and we should go ahead and take advantage of that for cost effectiveness and build flex space in case then we could have either a linkages to learning or some kind of out of school activity or something like that. Lo and behold, now we're talking about this issue of wellness centers, right? So again, I think that on a macro level, there needs to be that kind of conversation among leadership and among analysts and amongst staff in reassessing how we are going to utilize our resources, because that will inform how we advocate at the state level, and how we leverage what we have here as well, and then push to have a more equitable distribution of funds, but that is going to then be, maximized to match the needs on the ground. So I wanted to share that because it's something that I at every different meetings that I'm, present, I feel like that piece is missing. This acknowledgement that so many things have changed dramatically and that funds are going to be, finite. And so it's an opportunity to make some bold shifts in how we are utilizing our physical space and how we're matching that to the programs and how the programs are matching our physical space, so we can get, the best possible outcomes. So anyway, I just wanted to plant that seed. I think that it's best to be proactive than reactive, which I feel like we're in that moment right now, given some, these horrible events that we had to experience in our schools. It's important, I think, for us to be a bit more proactive. So I hope that process can begin to take place.
Well, thank you very much, Councilmember Navarro, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I think you're a great example about libraries is right on point. And I hadn't even thought about that, but it's so true. It's like we've redefined what our libraries are. Councilmember Juan is our lead for libraries, knows all too well. And it wasn't that we didn't have some of these things happening in our libraries, but it was not the go-to. It was not an automatic to where you said, I want to learn a language. I'm going to go to the library and learn the language and check out all of the resources that are there to teach you a new language so that I can upskill myself, right? It's not just because, but it's also because I need that, because that'll give me greater job opportunities. Those are the kinds of things that, again, are provided to our constituents, and we would expect nothing but. And the same thing applies to within our school buildings, that we accept nothing but, right? And so it really is that new notion of where we are as a society in terms of what we expect our schools to be doing for our children. And that means that the buildings are going to look different. They're going to support our kids differently. They're going to be more flexible in terms of their space. So Seth, I have another question for you and Ms. Dawson, I guess, because again, as we've heard the financial piece of this, you will hear people push back and say, you don't have to build as big. You don't have to, if you're doing flexible space, you can do that and eliminate the need for all of these various rooms that support all these different things that you're doing in the classroom. Talk a little bit about the affordability aspect, from the standpoint of what it is and how we can build and what we've been trying to do to maximize space while also supporting the programming we have. But then also, Ms. Dawson, just in terms of where we are as far as costs of buildings go and those sorts of things as well, because I think that it's important for our folks that are watching and listening to understand that we're looking at that piece of it too. It's not just about saying that we just want to build and build to the biggest capacity we can because we can justify it via programming, but some of the other changes that we've made in terms of how we're doing our buildings to ensure we're maximizing every dollar.
So those are excellent questions, and I would say one of the big changes we've gone through from a Montgomery County Public Schools perspective, and I believe this is exactly what Councilmember Navarro was speaking to, was this idea of a few years ago we changed our approach to just having this list. You know, we were just going to follow this list for the next 10, 20 years. I think from an affordability standpoint, and also from making sure that we provide the right services to the right communities, took a step back, and we're looking at our projects very differently now from a perspective of how many problems can we solve with one build. You know, so I do think, you know, the change in our approach, the change in how we prioritize projects, the change in how we view partnerships, that we want more services in schools. You know, you're going to see projects that are being constructed that will have community supports during the day versus just having it, you know, the outside the school hour timeline. So we are going through, you know, quite a bit of those changes just from a priority, from a focus area perspective. And that truly does lend itself to making sure our projects are cost effective. Yes, sometimes these buildings become bigger than what we're used to, but when you start to think about what spaces they provide, what services they provide, those services need to have a home. They need to have a place to not only serve community members and students, but also, you know, how do we function? How do we locate core services that also go out to schools and or go out to communities? So there's a lot of components that go into our schools, and we are trying to make them as cost effective as possible. And I'm very, very thankful that we've had this opportunity to walk through this process, because it shows that our buildings don't fit into this prescribed box that we've been trying to fit in for many, many years. And I think it does help shed the light on why some of our schools have different features or different aspects that many are not used to seeing in a school. But one important thing that you do talk about is the cost. You know, we are going through unprecedented inflation. We are going through you know, across the board challenges from obviously operating to capital, but particularly in the capital costs. So every cost saving measure that we can apply, we are looking for ways to do that. And these partnerships are key to figuring out ways as a county we can afford some of these projects. So I would also say a big thanks to OMB and Mary Beck in terms of working with us to think differently about our budget. You know, how do you think about it from a perspective of a county budget versus, you know, just a school, a park, a health and human services? How do you think about it as a whole budget, and how do we stretch our dollar further? So I do think we're trending in a very good place to try to mitigate these elevated costs. But I would say a big thank you to the group and having everyone start to think differently about our processes.
And I would just add on to exactly what Seth is saying, is that, you know, we're grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion. And certainly with the idea of a building comes the idea of innovation. So as we're meeting the needs for our students in so many ways, how can we be innovative with the building itself to really house the programs we need now? And I think that's what, you know, Seth is talking about in terms of always trying to think outside of that box. But it's difficult when there are limitations to a prescribed footage or specific things like that. So that's what makes it a little difficult, but certainly not surmountable. And, you know, we're, again, grateful for the conversation and the level of thinking and, you know, where we are right now with what we have in front of us.
And Mr. Chair, if I might add, OLO briefly looked at some similar buildings in larger counties that have these support programs in Baltimore and Howard and Anne Arundel. And we found that if you calculate it on a square foot per student basis, the schools MCPS build are comparable in size to those in the other jurisdictions. So to your question about where are we across the state, there are others who are facing the same challenges. And Montgomery County is not building, when you account for these programs, generally larger than others with similar situations.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Trumka. And again, it highlights where we are. And I do want to thank Ms. Beck as well and her whole OMB team who have worked hand in hand with the school system over the past few years to really develop a great working relationship, but also an understanding of how we need to prioritize and maximize every dollar invested. And so we have grown tremendous strides in terms of how that relationship works and also the accomplishments that we've been able to make, maximizing, especially when it comes to build to learn dollars, maximizing every single one of that to draw down. But at the end of the day, I think that what we've seen from this report is that these 6 recommendations that OLO has put forth make sense for us. They make sense for the state as a whole. And so those that are looking at statewide office should pay very close attention. Nod, nod, wink, wink. My good colleague knows who I'm talking to there. But certainly ones in which when we look at, the flexibility that needs to be afforded to jurisdictions across this state, these kinds of recommendations do it. They dot the I's and cross the T's, really with solidifying what it is that we need to do from now on when it comes to addressing the challenges that we're finding. And so from that perspective, I just really want to thank OLO for their great recommendations. Let me turn to Councilmember Juwanda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also appreciate OLO's work in not only this project and product, but so many things that you all do. And it was very clear. I think if you're one of the millions watching at home, you understood what was being said. And something like school funding for construction, it's a super arcane kind of thing. So I really appreciate the clarity with which you presented it as well. And always happy to give a nod to our great libraries and librarians who have been, doing it for a long time, but throughout this pandemic have been providing so many different levels of service. And I'm glad my colleagues mentioned that. And I try to do this once a month, a reminder that Rosetta Stone is free at the library. There's a lot of things that we're doing that you can access subscriptions to learn another language or for whatever purpose you need it. So a good example of changing needs. And in the context of our schools, as we are continually talking about, every day we're talking about HVAC needs and spacing needs and social distancing. We want in programming all the things that we need. We want community schools, wellness centers. I'm glad that we have been on the forefront of having the space to innovate and do the programs that we've been able to do up to this point. Obviously, we need to do more. And I think the changes that are being discussed in the working group that Melanie Winger and her team presented on are positive, and I hope that we can move those forward this year to really actualize the Build to Learn and the blueprint. You're going to need that type of flexibility and more funding. I never forget when when I used to work on the Capitol Hill on the Education Committee, and I worked for Sherrod Brown from Ohio. You had our communities where you had to pass a levy in each local community to fund the school. You had to pass a tax, and it was on a ballot initiative, and it was always a big uphill battle. And thankfully, we don't have that same structure here. But there are so many communities that are struggling to fund. You have 100-year-old buildings in Philadelphia and places, just things that are just not, and we're not in that dire need in Montgomery County, but we do have some old buildings, and we do certainly have some in other parts of the state. So what a better time there's no better time rather than to make these types of investments and changes and recognize we're going to have to totally revamp our education system from nuts to bolts. And that includes the buildings that our kids walk into and that our teachers and educators are in serving in. If we've learned anything over the last 20 months is that the system delivery models are going to have to change, and our kids are going to need additional supports for the next several years and going forward. So this is a perfect time to be having this conversation. And the last point I wanted to make too, that we hadn't really made, but I know everyone agrees with, is that these buildings, the community school is literally used by the community. We've had conversations last week about not having enough space for extracurricular and other activities, and the community wanting to use space. And so I think, having buildings that are appealing, user-friendly, safe, easy to enter, that have flexibility, that's what we need more of, not less of. So I'm really hopeful that we can work with the state colleagues to get this done. And I know we'll do our part here on the county to, as we have been doing, since we're paying 85% for new buildings, we'll continue to do that. But glad that there might be some help on the horizon. So thank you. Just wanted to make those points.
Well, thank you very much, Councilmember Joanno, and it's a perfect tee up for our next conversation. So I did want to close with just saying to Ms. Winger that we certainly, as the Education Committee, remain committed to working with you. I know that myself in my role at MACO, not only as the representative for the County Council, but also as the Education Subcommittee Chair, do stand ready to work with you to ensure that these types of recommendations move forward, because it's not just about Montgomery County. While I am a Montgomery County Council member, and that is incredibly important, that's what I was elected to do. We were also elected to make sure that the betterment of our communities, our society, is one that also is a part of this. And so from that perspective, we see the role that this could play across the state of Maryland, not just here in Montgomery County. And I know that some of my rural jurisdictions and others that are out there certainly would stand to benefit from some of these changes as well. So we look forward to working with you in this coming legislative session, as well as my colleagues who will remain. We'll certainly look forward to working with you in future upcoming sessions as well. So thank you very much to everybody. Aaron, Stephanie, as always, fantastic report. And we will make sure that this is not just something that sits on our shelf, but something that becomes an action item for us in crusading forward to make sure that these policies and practices are much more in line with what we need to have to solidify our educational future here in Montgomery County. So thank you. All right. So colleagues, we are going to go on to our next item, which directly feeds in, which is our Montgomery County Public Schools Capital Improvements Program. We are in a place where, as we are pretty much every single year, we're stuck with having more projects than we have money for. And so this is one of those cases where, unfortunately, based on what we've seen in projections of what our need is versus the projections of what state aid will be, we find ourselves in a shortfall. And it may be confusing for some who may be watching, who hear about the state having a surplus and understanding the differences between operating dollars and capital dollars when it comes to the state surplus. But at the end of the day, what you heard from OLO, our Office of Legislative Oversight, in terms of what some of the policies and laws that are in place that restrict the amount of funding that states give to jurisdictions, means that local jurisdictions find themselves in this predicament. And without raising taxes, which many people are concerned about, especially in the midst of a pandemic, it makes it very hard for Montgomery County to continue to meet the need with the state aid, even though it has increased, not being what you found from OLO's report wasn't what we needed to, and isn't commensurate with the types of projects that we're putting forward. In terms of, we're still going to have this challenge. And so from that standpoint, it really is one where from us, based on our enrollment, our demographics, all of those kinds of things that we're seeing in a continued need in our schools, we continue to be challenged. And it's not a new story. This is something that, like I said, again, unfortunately happens every year. So today we're joined by Ms. Karamias, who is the director of the Division of Capital Planning for Ncps. We've got Mr. Adams with us as well, who we heard from earlier, who's the director of the Department of Facilities Management for Montgomery County Public Schools. We've got Mary Beck, who's our CIP manager with the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Veronica Joa, who is the Fiscal and Policy Analyst with OMB. and then Ms. Jeannie Dawson, who's the Chief of Finance and Operations for Montgomery County Public Schools as well. On our staff side, I want to thank Ms. Essie McGuire, as well as Mr. Keith Levchenko for all of their great work, and then Ms. Rodriguez Hernandez, all staff who have contributed to help with our packet. And so just understanding some of the affordability challenges that we have in this upcoming budget. We're going to do typically what we normally do, which is ask the Montgomery County Public Schools to provide a non-recommended list of reductions from its CIP request. But I don't want to delve into or dwell on that too much today in terms of details around that, colleagues. What I think that we need to do is just get a picture of what the landscape is. Obviously, we can talk about what some of the puts and takes are at a follow-up meeting, but this will just give us an opportunity to kind of level set where we are in terms of from a fiscal picture. And then from there, we can talk about some of the other things that we may need to do to react. I will just say that Montgomery County, and I highlighted this before in our last session, Montgomery County has done a great job in terms of really figuring out how to maximize every dollar. We've been very strategic in terms of how we're laying out projects and moving things around to help to accommodate. And so really want to thank everybody who's on the call today who has been committed to making sure that the impact that we have on our schools when it comes to meeting the needs of our school children and our communities is at the forefront. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of hard work behind the scenes. And so I thank each and every one of you for helping to make that happen. So with that, I will turn to our participants to kind of give us a lay of the land, but did want to turn to my staff first to just kind of lay out where we are at this point, and then we'll hear a presentation. So Mr. Levchenko, Ms. McGuire, the floor is yours.
Sure, I'm going to share my screen. We do have some slides to help us get through this in a efficient way. And this, as you mentioned, this is an overview. We haven't even had public hearings yet for the CIP. Those are next week. So we're not talking about making any recommendations for the committee today, other than the one you spoiled, Mr. Rice, about the non-recommended reductions. But we will sort of give you the lay of the land, fiscal overview, and some of the challenges we face, and what we'll be doing sort of schedule-wise going forward. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay.
You might click the presentation mode, Keith. It'll just take away the side pieces.
All right, how's that?
There you go.
Okay. First, just real briefly, I did want to talk a little bit about enrollment, and we do have some slides that Ncps staff provided in the packet itself. Obviously, enrollment and capacity are very important drivers of both, well, the enrollment's a very important driver of both the operating budget, obviously, and the capital. But especially in the capital, it's a major element in a lot of our individual school needs. And as you can imagine, the last 2 years have been a bit complicated with the ongoing pandemic. And we've seen less predictable enrollment patterns, and we've seen lower enrollment than was previously projected. And also significantly lower enrollment projected going forward. We are based on MCPS's projections, expecting enrollment to pick back up and increase again. But those increases, if you look at the out years, would still end up with fewer students at the end of this CIP period than were projected a couple of years ago. So that's sort of the general lay of the land. That the idea is that enrollment has dipped because of the pandemic, but that it will rebound, but not to the levels that had been projected a couple of years ago. So what that means is that as staff, we're going to obviously look at all the capacity projects for the committee again this year. It's a full CIP year, and we'll consider it in the context of these projections and see what comes up. We're not making any assumptions right now about any changes to projects or anything like that, but just be aware that given this landscape, we are going to take a look at that. The other thing I wanted to mention is the economic and racial demographic information. We've provided a chart in the packet. This obviously is a very detailed chart. We don't expect people to be reading it right now, but it does provide information by project that will help inform the racial equity, social justice lens, if you will, that both the executive and the council have been directed to do with both legislation and the CIP and operating budget. So we'll be looking at projects a lot of different ways, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but one area we'll be looking at will be some of the racial and economic data by project and what that may imply. Okay, now just getting real big picture, the fiscal summary of the CIP. This chart basically walks you through the amended CIP as of July 1st, the Board of Education's request, and then the county executive's recommendation. The Board of Education's request, first, that upper part of the chart, shows about $148 million increase, which is about a 9.2% increase over the 6 years. And most notably, you see some big increases in those first 4 years of the CIP. And that's not unusual. It's pretty common for the school CIP when they're requesting new projects, they tend to have those new individual school projects or other major renovation projects. They tend to show significant spending in the earlier years of the CIP as they move forward from design into construction. Sometimes when we defer projects, that'll push them out. Or with the major capital projects, we have some projects on the back end of the CIP. But overall, you're still seeing a fairly heavily front-loaded CIP, and that does create challenges for us with our level of bond funding being basically flat across the 6-year period. The executive's recommended CIP, for the first time that I can remember, is actually higher than the board's request. We'll get into that in a minute. But it still does require some significant changes, which we'll get into. So here are the executive's recommendations and why his recommended CIP is actually higher, but still requires reductions. So bear with me. First, you do have some adjustments based on recent activity at the council, where we amended 5 elementary school projects. These are both the Clarksburg Elementary School number 9 project you see there, as well as 4 projects in the major capital projects umbrella project. So that was about $21 million in increased costs in this 6-year CIP period for those projects. This happened after the board's request came out, so they're not reflected in the board's request. But it's the latest information for these projects, so the executive put it in as he should. The other 2 elements that are new in the executive CIP are 2 placeholder projects that are intended to leverage state aid. And they're noted here as the Built to Learn state aid match, which is intended to provide some additional local funding in the later years of the CIP to help us with the match we would need for Built to Learn, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then also a prevailing wage placeholder, which actually starts, in the early years of the CIP as well. And this is intended to provide prevailing wage to selected projects where there's an assumption that the projects would benefit with greater state aid if they are done with prevailing wage and can move beyond the 25% cap that you heard earlier in the first presentation. So this would not provide prevailing wage to every project in the CIP, but to those projects that OMB basically identified as likely candidates to benefit from the prevailing wage to get additional state aid. So with all that, you have the increases. But in order to make the numbers work in the executive CIP, you have this last item here, which is called an affordability reconciliation project. And this is something that we see every year every 2 years in the full CIP, but also in the amended CIP years as well. This is basically a undesignated reductions project that brings the Board of Education's proposed CIP in line with what the executive can afford based on his assumptions. And we'll talk about those assumptions in a minute. And the news here is that you're looking at about a $65 million reduction over 6 years. But more crucially, if you look in the early years, FY 23, 24, and 25, you see reductions closer to about $235 million, or deferrals, basically, moved out to the later years of the CIP. So you're seeing an overall reduction of about $65 million in that project. But a lot of those dollars well beyond that would have to be pushed out of those early years. And I was mentioning the executive's macro assumptions, and I know the GO committee went over a lot of these already, so Ms. Navarro can speak to this as well, and she can also speak to the GO committee's discussion. First, with regard to spending affordability, the executive does assume about $70 million higher in bond funding over the 6-year period than what the council approved last fall. This falls all within the last 4 years of the CIP, since his 23 and 24 numbers are the same as what the council approved. The council doesn't approve year by year after the first 2 years, but ultimately that 70 million would be coming out of those last 4 years in some manner. Depending on what the council does, it is acting on spending affordability on Tuesday. If it goes with the original council assumptions, which is what the GO committee recommends, then we will have 70 million less in bond funding resources than what is in the executive's recommended CIP. So that's something we would have to deal with. If they go with the executive's recommendation, then we're at the same baseline as the executive. Recordation and impact taxes. This is another significant element in the executive's recommended CIP. Based on recent revenue experience, the executive is assuming significant increases in the recordation tax and the school impact tax beyond what was assumed in the amended CIP. And I did want to emphasize there's no assumed change, legislative change in either of these. This is just trend experience in terms of receipts from these two taxes and the Department of Finance's assumptions going forward with regard to these. So the executive CIP assumes these higher levels of revenue, and both of these are obviously dedicated to the school CIP. And then with PAYGO, which is obviously broader, it goes across the entire CIP, the executive is assuming basically the 10% fiscal policy level with some adjustments in a couple of years to actually push it slightly higher than that. But basically returning to the 10% policy level that we were not able to accommodate last year. You might recall the council reduced PAYGO the last couple of years for fiscal reasons. So these assumptions would bring that back to the 10% policy level. There's also a modest increase in current revenue in the school CIP above the amended CIP. And as you probably know, for most of the current revenue in school CIP goes towards the technology modernization project, although there's also current revenue reflected for relocatable classrooms and facility planning. And then state aid for school construction. We've talked a lot about that today. The executive's recommendation does assume a significant increase in it. And this gets at the issue of built to learn and the fact that under built to learn, based on our most recent assumptions about the gross area square foot allowance per student being higher for many of our projects when they go through built to learn, that means that we would be eligible for a significant amount more state aid for those projects. And this is exactly why back on January 11th, the council approved amendments to those 5 elementary schools that were able to take advantage of this element of the Built to Learn program and substantially increase the assumed state aid for those projects. So the executive's recommendation plays that out over the full CIP for those projects where we believe they could follow a similar path.
Mr. Levchenko, before you go on to that other slide, I did have Councilmember Navarro had her hand up. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. Yeah, I always find it a bit odd when we have conversations about CIP because it's like we're working in silos. So obviously on Tuesday, we're going to take up the spending affordability guidelines, and Gene Smith prepared a really great packet. We had a really awesome discussion, but I want to make sure that we connect all the dots. The Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee decided not to increase the spending affordability guidelines in the out years as the executive had recommended. And even though the indicators are not that different, we felt that one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is our debt service, and how as our debt increases, it really does then walls off operating dollars, and it has been a problem, and it has been growing. And so we've started slowly, this council has started slowly to turn this humongous ship around, and we wanted to be consistent because we also recognize that the next council can come back in January, given that this increase was in the outer years, and make some tweaks if necessary, given that by then we would have a clearer picture regarding the infrastructure bill dollars, regarding some of the state aid decisions and things of that nature. And so we didn't want to just sort of get ahead of all of this and get back into some type of pattern where we just go ahead and increase spending affordability guidelines, understanding the impact on our debt service. I think it's important to be disciplined in that way, but we also recognize that there are some opportunities from some additional dollars that are very unique in that instance. So I just wanted to share that, to put things into perspective. Obviously, this does not affect any of the projects that are, in these in this first years, the ones that are already happening and some that are going to start. But if we don't realize some of these other types of revenues, again, the next council in January would have an opportunity to make some tweaks as well. So I don't know what the council will do on Tuesday, but that was the rationale for the government operations decision. And we agreed with the rest of the recommendations regarding things like pay-go. Also, recordation taxes are pretty high. So that was good news. It was welcome news. And we agreed on the rest of it. So little preview for what's coming on Tuesday.
Back to you, Mr. Levchenko.
Sure.
Thank you, Member Navarro.
All right, just a little more detail on the state aid. This just shows the numbers by fiscal year. And they do decline near the end because, as I mentioned, a lot of the school's projects are towards the early years of the CIP. So we don't necessarily have defined projects at the end. And this also gets at why the Built to Learn match project is important. It's basically a set aside to help us carve out some room that we know we will need in order to continue to get some additional state aid. So that's just one element here. But also, to the degree some of the changes that you heard about in item number 1 come to be, beyond the Built to Learn 150% gross area square foot baseline, which I had mentioned, if some of those other changes occur, we might see some positive benefit from that that's not reflected here yet. But I think, as Mr. Rice knows, it is healthy to be a bit cynical about state aid and the Interagency Commission on School Construction. They often do give with one hand and take with the other. So we want to make sure, and maybe our delegation can really drive something home this year. But we want to be careful not to assume changes that haven't occurred yet. And so the executive's recommendation does take into account Built to Learn, but it is not assuming some of those changes that you heard we are pursuing as part of item 1. Just a little bit more background for folks. I've repeated here the NCPS CIP priorities. These appear in the acting superintendent's transmittal from November 1st. Not really much change here, but it is important each year for folks to see this. I think the school system has a quite a broad variety of projects that cut across all sorts of different areas of infrastructure, basically the way our CIP does. And they have to prioritize. And this is their order that they pursue. This doesn't mean you do all of number 1 and nothing in number 6, but it does mean that it gives them a way to look at their projects and make sure they're protecting those level of effort projects up front that they feel are most important. And then, of course, from the council's perspective, we have our review process and our priorities that we have to look at. And I've listed some of the big ones here, and they should look pretty familiar. I mentioned earlier the racial equity and social justice considerations that the council is moving forward with. We also have the climate action plan recommendations. One of the new MCPS projects is a sustainability initiative project. So it would presumably include things that the climate action plan would be very much in favor of. So that's something we need to look at. The state aid implications for projects is very important for all sorts of fiscal reasons. Some projects are likely to get more state aid than others. Our systemic projects, the roof and HVAC, tend to get about 50%. It's a very good balance. We don't lose a lot in lack of eligibility in those. On the other hand, some projects, because of the adjacent capacity or square footage issues not related to Built to Learn, those projects can be deeply penalized. So if you delay a project that is doing very well with state aid, then you lose that state aid too. So it's something we have to keep in mind. And then more generically for the CIP in general, the council obviously looks at new projects that we're seeing for the first time. Those projects have not gone through a review yet. They don't have any timing yet in the CIP. So we look at those and when we think we could afford to include those in the CIP. And of course, we look at increases in approved projects. You heard Mr. Adams earlier speaking to construction cost increases that we're seeing across. It's really across the board, not just in the schools, but the schools are seeing significant cost increases for their approved projects. And then we have projects that are under construction or imminently under construction versus projects that are still out a bit. And obviously, as you expect, it's easier, it's more feasible to delay projects that are not yet under construction than projects that are. So we take that into consideration as well. For capacity projects, as I mentioned earlier, we will be looking at utilization trends by school, and I think, as we mentioned with the school's non-recommended reductions, to the degree they identify capacity projects, they'll be doing the same thing. And our systemic projects, we look at the annual level of effort in those projects and what kind of backlogs or replacement cycles are associated with those projects. We have a periodic report that's done called the Infrastructure Task Force Report that looks at countywide at systemic projects. And it provides information about the inventory of work that needs to be done, the life cycle, the preferred life cycle, or the level of effort that you would want to do if you had sufficient resources versus what is actually happening. So that's another area where we can look at projects and decide whether the project actually needs more funding or whether it can be slowed down, or if it is, what is the impact of that? And then, as Mr. Rice mentioned, with the schools process, we're looking at another non-recommended reductions affordability exercise this time around, and we need this NCPS's help with that to get us to a place where we know what the trade-offs are at different funding levels. So with that, I'm just going to briefly go through these projects. And once again, this is all in the packet. So to the degree you or your staff have questions about the timing of projects or costs, we can bring those up. First, I did want to show the new individual school projects and the new projects that are in the major capital projects, umbrella projects. You have Burtonsville and Greencastle Elementary School additions. Those would be new. They're not in. They don't have planning or design or construction in the CIP. So these would be new projects in the CIP. And then you also have two planning and design related, or projects with planning and design only that would be inserted in the major capital projects, Piney Branch Elementary School and Eastern Middle School. So these projects would go through an initial planning process, and then the schools would come back when they've decided if and when to seek construction based on their latest assumptions about scope and timing for the projects. So this is an example where you have projects getting in the CIP that have some spending in the early years, but we would expect in the next couple of years to see the construction costs for these projects appear in the CIP, but there's nothing in the CIP at this point. So that's sort of another example of how the out years of the CIP are artificially low from what they likely will be when we get closer to those years. Then we have a number of projects that are moving into construction. So I've just listed those here. Notably, the major capital projects, these were the elementary schools that were the subject of the prevailing wage amendment in January. They also had construction cost increases that were accommodated in amendments last fall. So they are fully funded projects, and hopefully moving forward, Mr. Adams can provide more on that if you're interested. Then we have a number of projects. Oh, sorry, I wanted to go back. Also, the Woodward High School reopening is actually a two-phased project. Phase 1 is under construction, but phase 2 is not yet. The numbers here for this school show that both phases, and we'll work that out as we review that project going forward. A number of projects not yet under construction, especially in the major capital projects. We have a number of high schools that would be completed during the 6-year period. They'll be moving into design and construction in the early years of the CIP. So that's a major driver of expenditures. And then, of course, you have a number of other projects above. These are all existing projects in the CIP, but they have not quite moved into construction yet. They're in different stages of design. Then we get to the countywides, and I'll let Essie, if she wants to take this section, and I'll flip the slides as she asks.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate it. And we'll just talk very briefly about the impact that the countywide project requests have on the CIP. As folks are aware, this is a really important component of the CIP as well, to have these projects that are what we call umbrella projects and encompasses work to a number of schools over the 6-year period to maintain that infrastructure and give some additional life and quality of life to the schools. There are a number of systemic projects at the beginning here that we typically see each year that have a very consistent level of effort and are not recommended for any changes in this CIP, and that's this table here. We can go ahead and flip, Keith. Thank you. The school system and the board have requested some new countywide projects. The Early Childhood Center project is a project that we have seen before to construct permanent space at Watkins Mill High School for to house the Up County Early Childhood Center. But the project does indicate also that may continue and look at other opportunities for similar construction for early childhood. Emergency replacement of building components. This is a CIP project recommended to respond to some of those more urgent needs for systemic replacements, and therefore allow the planned systemic replacements in the projects to sort of continue uninterrupted. The material management building relocation, the warehouse that's on Stone Street, there's been a lot of interest in a number of years in being able to relocate and expand that building to meet the current capacity. And that's the recommendation here is to begin that process. And then the final new project relates to sustainability initiatives and having some funding dedicated to meet a wide variety of projects related to sustainability across the schools. We did want to highlight too a number of the projects here that are requested for an increased level of effort. And as you can see, the requested increase over the approved level in the first 2 years of the CIP is fairly significant. We just highlighted it briefly here what the increase is over the approved in each of these projects and what the total increase is. Again, this is not the total for the projects. This is just the total increase requested in 23 and 24. And I would just note that these are some of the core, really important systemic projects that I know council members have heard about each year. HVAC for those air handling systems, ADA compliance has had a great deal of attention in recent years. And certainly all of these, again, represent significant, important infrastructure elements. Next slide. We also just wanted to highlight that there are a number of level of effort projects where the funding is identified and requested in the first 2 years, but we do know that often and typically those projects are expected to be ongoing and to have funding requests recur, but those requests are not currently showing in the CIP. And as Keith was talking about earlier, we just really do want to bear in mind the fact that costs, across a wide range of projects, both individual and countywide, will increase as those outer years come back, cycle towards us. And so again, as a result, if we extended, if it were to be in the future that these projects were extended at their current rate, it would have a significant impact on the CIP that may come back to us in future CIP cycles. Next slide. Wanted to highlight just very briefly the major capital projects. Again, as we've talked about, Piney Branch and Eastern have been added to this, and we will go more in depth about the capital projects and all of these projects in a subsequent committee session.
Yeah, and just to summarize what you've heard in these slides, we do have some large undesignated reductions or deferrals that would be required in the CE recommendation. Just to reiterate, it was about a $65 million reduction over 6 years, but more importantly, $235 million in those first 3 years, 23 through 25. And this is even with a big assumed bump in state aid. And as we've talked about, this is really coming about for several reasons. One is significant cost increases, and we've talked about the market conditions, and then also prevailing wage, which it does get us more state aid, but it also does increase costs, at least based on the construction bids that we've experienced the last couple of years. We also do have the new projects that we talked about. So they're not in right now. So every dollar of those adds to the CIP. And then the front-loaded nature, which we've talked about, which complicates the reconciliation of the CIP. It's no blame to Ncps. This is the way they can manage their projects. They don't know necessarily what they're going to need in year 6 in terms of capacity, or shouldn't necessarily plan that far ahead, given the uncertainty in the numbers. But it does complicate the CIP when we have a front-loaded CIP of this size. And then the other thing that was just mentioned, we do have the out years of the CIP, which are understated for a couple of reasons. The level of effort projects, which Essie just mentioned, and then also, of course, you've got, as I mentioned, likely individual school and major capital projects that will be in the pipeline. They're just not reflected yet. So going forward, we do expect to have a couple more committee meetings, one most likely in late February or early March, and then another one later in March to review specific projects. But today, what we're recommending is that the committee ask the Board of Education to have Ncps put together a package of non-recommended reductions, similar to past years, that can bring us closer to the request of the county executive, and get us to a point where we understand what it would take to get to those numbers, while we are also still working out some of these macro issues going forward, and what state aid will ultimately be, what our PAYGO will be, all those other issues that affect the size of the pie, spending affordability, of course. So it's really two things going on at once, the macro side, but also this micro side of how we build the budget to at least the executive's baseline at this point, which is the closest thing we have to a balanced CIP. And at the next DNC meeting, we will then go through individual projects and work through the non-recommended reductions and help the committee develop its recommendations going forward. And this is at the same time that we have all of the other committees looking at their portions of the CIP and bringing those to the council also, hopefully in the mid to late March timeframe. So we can begin to get a big picture of where we stand by the end of March. So that's all we have for the slides today, Council Chair Rice, and we're happy to take questions. And we have folks from OMB here, Veronica and Mary, and we also have Adrian and Seth from Ncps to help answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Lepchenko, and thank you to you and Ms. McGuire and Ms. Rodriguez-Hernandez, as always, for a great packet, great information that helps us to really understand where we find ourselves in this current time frame. As you heard from the GO chair, we are looking at doing things differently when it comes to budgeting and really getting ourselves out of. It's very interesting. Every time that I went to an education budget forum and I would talk about debt service, folks would get educated on debt service. And I always compared it to your credit card that folks had. And then folks would moan and about paying that interest on the borrowed money that you have and how much that can get out of control. And it really sometimes becomes larger than the amount of money that you're borrowing. And so from that perspective, or sometimes in our case, larger than some departments that we fund. And so from that perspective, it is something that we have to be mindful of. We can't just continue to borrow and borrow and expect that we're not going to have a way to get out of this. But there are other kinds of things that we can do as well. And I see Councilmember Joando's hands up, so I have a feeling what he's going to say, so I'm not going to talk about that piece of it. But we do have the state, and the state is sitting on a surplus this year. And when we're talking about current year revenue or over the first couple of fiscal years, there are some things that the state can do flexibly, whether it's grant programs like they've done with other jurisdictions throughout the state to help us through that kind of situation and keep things on track. So there's a whole bunch that's there. Of course, obviously, there's no one size fits all approach to this. I think it's going to have to be a little bit of everything kind of contributing together as we've seen in the past. And I can't think of a better team to have than all of you that are on this call today to help us through that and think strategically about what the best way for us moving forward is and what strategy is going to garner us the biggest amount of support to help our kids. That ultimately, at the end of the day, is what we're looking at here. And oftentimes we get stuck in numbers and not thinking about those individual children that are out there depending on us to make sure that they have, again, buildings that are commensurate with the expectations that we have for them and their bright futures. And so from that perspective, that's what drives us all to make this happen and makes this so important. So with that, let me turn it over to Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I often say this is my favorite committee, and one of the reasons is because you and Councilmember Navarro, I think, have the most institutional knowledge, or among the top of any of my colleagues. Councilmember Reimers, I think, similar time, but I still think you all have him. I know Councilmember Navarro has him beat, but I think, you might be right there. But we've seen this movie before, and I'm coming up on my fourth budget here, and we have to, be realistic with what the world is and where we are. And I think these two presentations together are really important to help present that to the public as well. And thank you, Keith and team and Essie and everybody who put this together. We always have to ask for non-recommended cuts. And I think obviously we're going to do that. And I totally concur, and we should get that list, but that's something I think in the context of all that's happened over the last 2 years and all the need that we have, which is greater, right? It's greater than it was before. We have to holistically reevaluate how we're supporting a whole range of systems, but in this context, our schools and our students and families, and the infrastructure of that, which is what we're discussing today. The capital side of that is a critical component. I think, going forward, as someone who hopes to be on the next council, as referred to, we make some decisions. I hope we can year by year get a smaller list of non-recommended cuts. Like, I'd like to see that list shrink and disappear, if possible at some point. And where, the school board in its elected capacity is doing its job to send to us what they need. And I think we're one of the best places in the country. And, Jack Smith used to always bring this up, our previous superintendent, nowhere in the country do we to support local education like here. And I think that's very true. And they do a great job of advocating for what they need. And our responsibility is to fund that at the level consistent with everything else going on that we can. And I'd like to see, and we always work it out. But, I think Councilmember Rice mentioned one way, the holistic solutions. Councilmember Navarro talked about another way, potentially for future council with the SAG guidelines. I think that we need to look at additional revenues. And we've talked about that at this committee before. We're in an unprecedented moment where the needs are great, and we're investing in the future. And yes, the state absolutely should look at using surplus and one-time money or grant funding or whatever tool is available to support local jurisdictions and meeting the needs of their students. But also locally, we should look at additional levers. And, I appreciated what was presented by Keith and team as far as the different levers we have, how much, what we're doing with PAYGO, what are we doing with the recordation tax. So I think, I certainly want to reiterate it, which I think is consistent with what this committee has said before, that we need to look at, once we get this list back, come back and look at the whole pie and see what adjustments we need to make. But that could need to be increased revenues as well. And I just think we need to be honest and upfront with that. And because one thing that's untenable to me is we all hate making these tough decisions, and we need to keep things on track, recognize the moment we're in. And so I just wanted to make that statement, and I'm glad I'll be able to work with my colleagues to hopefully do that in the coming weeks ahead. So appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, wrong button. No, thank you very much, Councilmember Giwando. And I think that, again, that's one of the things that we've always tried to do, but as of recent, have really been, and that's what I alluded to, again, with the great support of OMB, working together with our council staff, working together with Ncps. There's really been a solidification of the relationship that's there, and really trying to figure out the best way to move us all forward, understanding that we all have the same goal. And that is really, really important. Once you have that same goal that's there, creative minds can get together and really figure out the best sort of approach that makes sense for us. And of course, no options are, ruled out at this point. Obviously, we need to take a look and see. We need to see what some of those suggestions may be from the school system as they take a second look and can sort of scrub their numbers and think strategically about how some things may be accomplished a different kind of way. But of course, we play a part too as the revenue generators, and that is the county council. That is what we do. That is a key tenet. I remember my role on Ways and Means when I was with the state. It's our revenue generation for the state. It's what it is we do. I mean, so, those kinds of things happen. And so, we've put that decision off for a while. We actually thought we were going to get to it a little bit earlier, and then the pandemic hit and kind of disrupted our progress when it came to deciding what some of those steps were. So again, it's time for us to make some decisions. We'll certainly do those in context of what it is that we're looking to support. The challenges is that our CIP is larger than just our school system. While our school system has a big part of it, we have a whole bunch of other projects that are out there. I know that my colleagues have been talked to by many department heads who are concerned about their CIP projects and things of that nature, some of which are in folks' districts and other things that are priorities that they know that they care deeply about. And so there's a lot of puts and takes and moving parts in this whole thing as well. So, this isn't easy, as I think Councilmember Joando, you alluded to, but certainly one in which I think that we've always been up to the task, and we certainly will be this time as well. So let me turn Ms. Beck.
Thank you. I did just want to sort of highlight a couple of things that I think is useful sometimes when we're talking to the public. On page 5 of your packet, it was slide 5 on Keith's chart, or Keith's presentation. He talked about how front-loaded the CIP was. And I think that when we look at those significant cost increases that are in the early years, it's very important for the public to understand that it's just really not possible to fund those as requested. And I think everybody's committed to and wanting to do that, but we really can't. There's no way to do it exactly as requested. I think the other thing that we saw this year that was really unusual was the large degree of cost increases. And that was related to a couple of factors. One is the construction market, as we talked about, and the other is prevailing wage costs, which we needed to add to maximize the state aid. So before we do anything new, we've sort of got to probably take care of those things that were already in the works. And so we were already going to have a challenge. Fortunately, we had the increases in impact taxes and recordation taxes, but still that puts us in a bit of a bind. And I think that it's important. It's also important, I think, with the vocabulary that we use. We talk sometimes about deferrals of projects, but these may be projects that were never previously approved. And I think for the public, it's important to make a distinction in that regard, just so that they understand a true deferral is something that was fully funded for construction before that now we can't do on the schedule that was listed simply because of affordability, as opposed to, say, maybe implementation issues. So I think that it will be helpful if we can all try to be consistent in how we're explaining things to the public. I think the other thing Keith touched on was this new placeholder project, the Built to Learn State Aid Match. This was created because we've had sort of a structural problem in the CIP for a number of years now, where the Ncps CIP, for good reasons, was always very front-loaded in terms of how it was approved. But as Keith said, we're more likely to spend $300 million a year on the CIP than we are 200 or $100 million a year. And if we're not holding some capacity for future CIP projects for NCPS, we will program other projects with that money, and then we will be in a perpetual cycle of delaying those other projects. And so it gets into it creates this vicious cycle of us constantly disappointing the public because we've told them we were going to build a certain project on a certain time frame, and then we have to move it because we know we want to invest in schools. So we may or may not be able to afford that project this year, but I hope in having the conversation we can move that forward. Most of the extra bonds the executive had recommended were going to go to fund that designated set aside. But I hope that that's something we can work towards in the future if it's not something that we can managed to afford this cycle. But I think finding a better way to deal with that will give more certainty to the schools in terms of what they can reasonably expect to be able to program, and will allow us to avoid some of this constant turmoil that we have in the CIP.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Ms. Beck. And it really speaks to what Councilmember Navarro was talking about in her remarks. When it comes to our accounting approach needs to change a bit in terms of being a little bit more realistic about some of the challenges that we face and how we're putting that on our balance sheet, if you will. And so if we're not projecting that we're going to spend money, and then we spend money and utilize the money that we would have spent on something else, and then have to come back to it again and say, well, let's find the money that we knew we were going to spend, but we said we're going to spend it on something else, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's kind of like our debt service conversation. It's kind of like all those others. We've got to really start a better, cleaner accounting method when it comes to understanding where the puts and takes are when it comes to our CIP. And so what that does is it's going to create challenges for us, right? Because doing it differently is going to mean that you're going to have more of that compression, more of those drawdowns on those funds. But at the end of the day, if it's going to make for cleaner decisions into the future, it's something that I think that we certainly need to do. So I couldn't agree with you more that it's laudable for us to certainly try and get to a place to where those things are standards and not just aspirational. And so, you know, that also then speaks to what Councilmember Jawando was talking about, because if we are going to do that, then it does mean that we will need to look at revenue from a multitude of sources, that being not only what we can ask the state to step up and do, but also what we need to do locally as well. So all of those things go hand in hand, they're all connected. And so really appreciate your remarks there. Let me turn to my colleagues for any other remarks, or to anybody else who wanted to comment. I don't see any other requests to speak. So I think that based on where we are right now, we have a recommendation about submitting the letter. I don't see any objections from my colleagues in terms of requesting that a letter be sent with non-recommended reductions. So we will go forth and send that over to the Board of Education, asking for those non-recommended reductions. Again, understanding and highlighting that these are not reductions that are supported by Montgomery County Public Schools, but certainly ones in which if we were to make decisions on what it was that we needed to do to reduce projects funded by the CIP, that would be their preference as to how you would do something like that. So from that standpoint, I think we're good to go. Mr. Levchenko, have we forgotten any other decision point items that we'll need?
That's it for today. We'll get the letter drafted and out as quickly as we can.
Okay. Well, I want to thank my colleagues again. Thank you to Councilmember Navarro. Thank you, Councilmember Jawando. As always, great meeting. And then to all of you as stakeholders and partners, I appreciate each and every one of you. Now the hard work begins. So let's roll up our sleeves, let's work together, and let's figure out a solution so that we can make the best playing field for our kids. So thanks to you guys. Appreciate it. And you guys take care and stay safe. Have a great one.